Greetings and welcome to Room 42. I'm Liz Fraley from Single Sourcing Solutions. I'm your moderator. This is Janice Summers from TC Camp. She's our interviewer. And welcome to Dr. Daniel B. Richards today's guest in Room 42. Dan is an associate professor and associate chair of English at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. He also serves as the chair of ACM SIGDoc. His research focuses on environmental rhetoric, risk communication, and public understanding of science and the politics of higher education. His most recent project, a project funded through the Department of Defense, applies UX and rhetorical approaches to political negotiation between military readiness and renewable energy development. His work has appeared in Technical Communication Quarterly, the Journal of Business and Technical Communication, Contemporary Pragmatism, and several other journals and edited collections. His most recent edited collection on teacher neutrality in 2020 is available through Utah State University Press. Today, he's here to help us start answering the question, should we use simulation or realism to facilitate understanding and generate action? Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're very excited.
Oh, very happy.
Here. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. So now, when it comes to risk communication, what are we talking about? What types of things are we talking about when we're talking about risk communication?
Right. Well, broadly defined, communicating a risk is anything it could be really anything that's natural or that's man-made, anything that is a risk to another person. Right. That could be physical risk, emotional risk, psychological risk. Typically, in the way I deal with it is through environmental risk. So that could be something like, your hurricane readiness or something like that. It could be something like man-made disasters, anything like that. But risk also has that psychological aspect to it, where the perception of risk, where you could be at risk of things, but if it's not part of your psychological perception of it, then you might not feel at risk. So there's also kind of hidden risks that we're not really aware of versus the more dramatic ones like hurricanes or sea level rise or tornadoes or COVID or anything like that. There's a lot of kind of latent risks kind of built into the system that we tend to try to make known. But yeah, risk communication. There's still a lot of conversation about what risk communication is, what a risk is, and our obligation to communicate it and how to best communicate it.
Because it's not so simple of a thing, right? Because I had to sit there and think, well, what is risk really? Is it just I want to tell you well in advance of something happening, or is it that danger, that warning? Is it immediate, or is it pending? Where does it fall? And the word risk has a psychological effect, right? Mm-hmm. So, and does that also play into like someone's awareness of a risk?
Yeah, it does. So there are a variety of different ways of understanding or studying risk. So so we are at risk of things all the time that we might not necessarily be aware of, whether that's kind of in our diet or ecological things that we don't know, things in our water, other things like that. Mm-hmm. So we're constantly living, like Ulrich Beck calls it like a world risk society. We're kind of talking about there are risks that are inherent in nature, but then also we keep manufacturing and creating risks through our development. And it's kind of part of modernity to kind of come full circle. So we keep creating and making progress, but then there's kind of some risk, right? And then we have to create new science to address those risks, and then that new science is other risks, and then it's kind of like a circle. So but it is to me, in kind of where my interest is in the psychological part of it, which is kind of understanding people's perceptions of risk perceptions, public understanding of risks, and trying to understand how they kind of assess it, right? Because we're all messy humans, like sometimes it kind of strikes me sometimes of like I get on an airplane and I don't like going on airplanes. It's like, well, I make poor risk assessments like all the time. Like I'll drive 12 hours to go somewhere rather than a quick 45-minute flight. And it's like, that's not a safe decision, but we make very human.
Because there's all those risks along the way. Like there's a lot of risks in driving.
In a 12-hour drive.
So many, especially with screaming cans.
On top of the fatigue that can happen just from driving. Like, I get driving fatigue. I'm good for 3-4 hours and then I've got to stop and I get driving fatigue. But it's interesting because then in that constant evolution and that constant putting ourselves at risk, are we aware that we need to be communicated to at a different level, right? Because if we're trying to get through to somebody about a risk, this is that psychological challenge. It's like the frog in boiling water kind of thing. Like, how do you get them engaged and aware that this is a risk and I need you to understand, so I need you to stop and pay attention, right? That's kind of the goal.
Yeah, it's hard because we change risk based upon, or our perceptions change sometimes not necessarily because of the most effective, clear communication, right? So like, I have friends who are pilots and I'll talk about my, aversion, let's call it aversion towards flying. And they're like, what are you talking about? You're going to get in a car accident on the way to the airport sooner than you're going to get on the airplane, or get an accident on the airplane. So it's kind of, I'm aware of all the logic, all the statistics, all the stuff. It goes in one ear and out the other because I have an affective reaction to just stepping on board an airplane, So if we kind of extrapolate that out to other risks, we realize, well, just sharing data and sharing information and sharing statistics isn't really going to cut it.
Is not going to cut it, right? Because there's that emotional thing. And it's not necessarily based on an experience. I mean, unless you've been in a plane crash.
I have not.
So it's not based on like, well, I was in a plane crash, so now I'm averse to flying. That would make a little bit more sense, right? So there's that, we as humans have, I'm not picking on you, but all of us as humans have those things because we're emotional beings. Yeah. So
even the decision to smoke, or anything like that, it's like you're aware of the statistics, you're aware of it, you understand your longevity and the effectiveness of it, and you still engage in behaviors that are risky because they're kind of value judgments about what's worth it and what's not.
So how do you get through to people then to communicate that risk?
Well, the recent trend that I find exciting is to kind of localize it and kind of be very specific in terms of your risk communication towards specific demographics, certain social groups, or certain geographies, right? So because it is linked to affect and because it is linked to, the kind of softer elements of humanity in terms of kind of, for sea level rise, for example, like the sense of place you have towards that. So a global message for someone in Miami might not resonate because the kind of melting ice caps doesn't really evoke any sort of concern. It still seems distant. It seems like, okay, that's it. But if you can kind of localize messaging towards like, well, look, this specific part of Miami is going to be underwater or more at risk. It's going to affect the condo development or something like that. So you can make economic arguments, whatever it may be.
Beaches will shrink.
Beaches will shrink, right? And you're kind of tailoring it to their specific needs and their specific affect, the effective dimension of their understanding of the world around them, then that can be effective. The downside is that's really labor intensive. But for some people, the global messaging is, I don't think we can underestimate the fact that statistics and trust in science is still it's still common, right? So it's, we're convinced,
pretty much. But still, I see your point. People, unless it's local to them, they don't have that same impassioned understanding about it. When we talk about climate change, right? And unless something is happening locally, they have a harder time understanding. Like we've had a series of fires, and then people are starting to understand it's not that these things never happened before, and they do happen. It's the amount of times they are happening and the intensity that they're happening. So people here understand fires. People in Miami would understand the beaches eroding.
So how do you see in California though, like, because wildfires have just been a part of life for California even before the Industrial Revolution, right? So like, and how do you build that message to say, yes, these fires are still happening. These happened to your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your great-grandparents before that and all that stuff, but it's related to this bigger kind of abstract thing that you can't see. I'm always curious, like, this is same with hurricanes, right?
Getting that connection. Well, and it's funny because I was having a conversation with somebody and like I would say a couple of years ago, before we've had these series, most recently fires, they were kind of in that climate denying thing. It's like, and I'm like, no, it's the intensity. So now they're starting to understand because it happened closer to them. So now they're understanding, oh, it's that intensity. Yeah, we've always had fires. That's how it is, where California technically is a desert. So it's going to happen, but it's that, so they're starting to make sense. So how do you do this on a proactive rather than a reactive? Because this is like, okay, now you're finally getting it. But what we're talking about in risk communication is we want to avoid that risk.
Mhm.
Not crisis communication,
Yeah.
right? We're sort of
Yeah.
trying to step back a little earlier than
Make it
it's not
risk
crisis
communication
yet.
instead of crisis communication. Good point, Liz. Good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Well, especially with the hierarchy of understanding, it's like, because there's so many fires are going on and because you're just trying to literally live and get through the next day and get through the next week, the global message is you're just gonna, you don't even care, you don't have time
Right.
to think about that, you know?
Mhm.
So there's also that economic argument also, like, if you just don't even know what you're going to eat or where you're going to live over the next week or two, then the kind of global
Yeah.
argument about life 2050 or 2075, it's like, okay.
I don't know, I'm getting dinner
Next week.
tomorrow.
Right.
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 Yeah.
So there's kind of like a kairotic, like a timing element to it as well, you know? So do you kind of like communicate global risk on, like, you know, sunny day messaging, you know, it's kind of like everything's fine, it's good. Now we can kind of talk about this risk and address it. Because certainly in the midst of the other disaster, and we're kind of seeing this with COVID now, it's like I'm on another project talking about negotiating emergency management shelters during COVID.
Okay.
So, you know, like in the Southeast, for example, like, or any disasters across the nation,
Right.
saying, you know, the emergency management people who ran the shelters had to say, like, hey, there's a hurricane coming or a tornado coming, come to the shelter. But also the policies of COVID were changing. And so people have the sense of shelters being hundreds, if not thousands of people during emergency shelter.
Right.
So you kind of have what's called compound risk or concurrent risk, where you kind of have to negotiate that thing, get out of your house for the hurricane, but also now you've introduced another risk by being indoors with 1,000 people that you don't know, or 100 people that you don't know,
Mhm.
whatever it is. So that kind of compound risk really kind of, you know, has some sort of really does, you know, there's some really intense psychological gymnastics that you have to do, because choosing to shelter in place or go to a shelter even during hurricanes is a stressful enough decision. And you're kind of looking at your neighbors and you're trying to see who's boarding up, who's leaving, who's staying. You know, like the guy who's been there for 40 years is just staying put because he's seen this before. And you kind of have all these kind of like different reads of risk assessment. And you're kind of, especially for someone new to the region, you're trying to gauge how other people are reacting.
Mhm.
But then if it's big enough where you had to get out of the house or something like that, where are you going to go? You know, so they were using hotels and other things that are a bit more safer, but the kind of conception people have in their mind of a hurricane shelter is, you know, packed like sardines, right? And kind of just living in there for who knows how long. And now you're exposed to COVID. Yeah. So it's interesting to see that the psychological aspect of risk to me is inescapable. So I just kind of lean into it and kind of focus on that.
So are there better methods,
Strategies?
methods that work better than others as far as communicating risk?
So to go back to that point about localization, I've
Mhm.
found, you know, a lot of articles have found effectiveness in getting really, really local and taking global messages, putting them on a very local level. They found those they found those effective. But to assess the efficacy of a message, you kind of have to localize it anyway. And just kind of, you know, you could do a case study or qualitative or empirical work to see what actually impact is this message having. Because for too long, risk communication wasn't the art and practice of risk communication wasn't assessing how the efficacy of their message, right? They had scientists out there. What the information deficit model was, well, you're not acting appropriately because you're dumb and you don't have the data. Here you go, here are the data. You're smart now. And they're like, oh crap, they're still not behaving the way we want them to. Why is this? You know, so they weren't really kind of assessing as often, you know, the efficacy of the message and why it was good. So I think that's still pretty recent trend in risk communication to be able to actually highlight the specific strategies that they found useful in this, and hopefully build up enough case studies across enough geographical regions to build up organically some basic principles about what works in risk communication. But people are finding, it depends on the region. It depends on the type of risk, type of disaster too. So something that might work in sea level rise, for example, doesn't really work in hurricane preparedness, doesn't really work in COVID, for example, because there's just different types of risk. So the different categories of risk that you have also have to have their own kind of unique models for how you're communicating that. So yeah, it's hard to articulate kind of general, you know, axiomatic truths about risk communication, other than, to me, one of the consistent things that I could confidently say is You have to talk with the community, and the messages have to be foregrounded in people's real understanding, their mental model, as it's called. They're like their mental model of the idea. And if the communication doesn't start with the public mental model of what they have in terms of the conception of the risk,
Mhm.
then chances are you're just kind of shooting blindfolded. So that is definitely one principle of praxis. How that emerges
Mhm.
based upon each specific geographic region or each specific risk will kind of vary.
So making it realistic for the local area, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that
Mhm.
they have a better conception.
Yeah. And, in the field of TechCom was kind of reading ahead of the curve, right? So, Jeff Grable and Michelle Simmons had an article in 1998 called Critical Rhetoric of Risk. And that was kind of one of the touchstone articles in our field because they were arguing that risk communication is socially constructed, which comes out of like critical cartography and kind of stuff that was happening in the early 90s about and psychometric paradigms of risk, and the kind of affective dimensions of risk was kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, where they started to understand that, wow, people are messy. We need to talk about this. But TechCom was that was 1998 that they published that. And that was a really important article for myself and my research, but also just for our field and for others as well. And they were focusing on, making it community centric, making it localized. And the rhetorical efficacy of a message is really only as good as the degree to which you understand the community that you're communicating to, which seems glaringly obvious to anyone in rhetoric, this rhetoric 101, but to think of it in terms of risk communication and think about a risk as a dialogue as opposed to a top down, here's a risk assessment, and then you communicate that. That was pretty fundamental at the time. That was a pretty paradigm shift. That I found really useful, and I know a lot of others do.
Right. Having putting that the receiver of the information first changes that whole dynamic of how you communicate, right?
Yeah.
Because the science and the data is important, and that's great, but you're not, unless you're communicating with another scientist, right? It's like in academia, as long as we're communicating with other academics, that's great. But when we try to communicate with those who are not in academia, there's a different language, there's a different, right?
There is, and there's different things that convince, right? So if you're in academia or in science, data are convincing to you, so you're going to turn around and think that that's convincing to everybody else, and it's not. So that's why I think a lot of the best projects have an interdisciplinary team where you have someone in social sciences who understands social psychology, you have someone who understands subject matter expert in science, someone in communication, for example, to really understand the complexity of it. But it's just a lot of work because you have to get to understand people are so messy. And I think if you were to ask anyone like why they make the decisions they do, they're not going to use data to justify that position. We all make really messy, risky, non-logical decisions constantly.
Right.
Yeah, because of these other multitude of factors. In the specific piece that we're writing for realism stem from, we were doing work on sea level rise viewers before, and then we noticed a trend that they were integrating these images of localities in their sea level rise viewer, right? So before it would just be kind of a two-dimensional map. You would find your place, you would take the slider, you'd say, how many feet of water would it take for my house to get flooded? And it was it was an open data exploration tool, and it was used by city planners, non-experts. But what people were finding is that the public were using it at a higher frequency than they anticipated, even though it wasn't designed for them. So they were using it, so it was just kind of understanding data. And then these images started to emerge of landmarks, so to speak, of here's this house, or there's the structure, the statue, whatever it is, landmark in scare quotes, because that's a public valuation too, right? It's
right.
Landmark for one person.
There's town square, that kind of thing, right?
Right. Yeah. So we were curious. So on a very granular level, right? This project started on a very granular level where we were looking through it and we were confused, and we just wanted to know why they were choosing the images that they did. Right, because we saw it as a broader rhetorical move to kind of use realism as a way to kind of help another contextual layer of understanding for how they might be able to integrate into their mental schema, this notion of sea level rise. So maybe if we actually showed what their house would look like, if it was, or showed what their beloved downtown actually would look like at 6 feet of water, maybe that would evoke something. So we saw it as a vision of pathos, kind of like an actual emotional appeal towards one sense of place.
Mhm.
But then we asked them and we emailed NOAA, who is the sea level rise, their digital coast tool, and we emailed them about the decisions, why they chose it, and there was no
Right.
grand scheme behind it whatsoever. They weren't,
Right.
doing focus groups with, okay, what statue is most beloved to you? What's, because
Which
like some
ones
of the
evoke more
landmarks,
emotion? Yeah.
right? Some of the landmarks
Right.
were like Virginia Beach Visitor Center, and it's like people in Virginia Beach would never go to the visitor center because they're never visitors.
They're
So
like,
why
oh,
would you?
surprised we have one.
Why? Yeah,
Oh, is that what
yeah.
that
They were
is?
like, we had some people from Virginia Beach be like, "Where is this? I don't know. Why would we need flyers of our hometown?" So, and there's real considerations, and I don't want to critique NOAA with that, because
Funny
obviously
though.
they were hamstrung during that administration, and they were having their funding cut, so they were kind of,
Right.
not able to maybe do what they knew that.
Right.
But so we're having a conversation, and he said, here's the criteria. It has to be open source. It has to, kind of more technical criteria for that. So no emotional thing. So they were engaging in this rhetorical.
Has to be in that area. The building has to be in that area.
Right.
Recognizable.
Right. That's it. Right. So they were trying to engage in this emotional appeal, almost this assumption that realism is inherently more effective. So that maybe, the kind of two-dimensional, just kind of, like Google Maps type view of water wasn't really eliciting maybe the type of emotion. But we found interesting is you had this data center tool that was really just used for decision making, like top level decision making, not anything to like really do any kind of like rezoning or like project development or something like that, but just kind of to give you a top level view of the area. And then they threw this curveball of images in there, and we thought, well, what are you trying to do here? Are you trying to elicit understanding of the data, or are you trying to do something a bit emotional by including the landmarks there? So we were curious about that. And so then we went down the rabbit hole of realism as kind of a technique in risk communication. And, the Weather Channel has done a lot of realisms in terms of the simulations, right? They do the flooding, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, and it's really kind of hyper real in terms of actually placing the weather correspondent in the simulated environment so that people could know. So what's happening in sea level rise is there is a trend towards realism as a way to kind of communicate the degree to which just how serious it is. So like this could be any country. So Sydney, Australia is, so like here's what downtown Sydney, here's
right.
what the what's that, the Opera House or the main place in
No,
Sydney?
it's the Opera House. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of like where it would be, because that's right on the water. So all these different things.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of rhetorical assumption that realism is always better. But then when you go to the actual research in cartography in terms of what happens when you juxtapose realism onto a map, or superimpose, realism onto a map, it gets complicated, because in cartography, they want the level of realism to match the level of confidence in the data, right? So if an image or a map or something is super real and kind of one-to-one correlation to reality, then the expectation from the scientists and scientific community and the cartographical community is that their confidence in that data about what it would look like is at that same level. Whereas if they had kind of low confidence, big, maybe the water will go here, we're not sure, then you want that image to be lower quality, right? So the image quality has to match the confidence of data, which is the kind of scientific premise of it. So we were seeing these kind of two rhetorical assumptions kind of thrown together rather haphazardly, and we saw that as an opportunity to kind of really investigate, well, like the title of the article is, said, how real is too real? What level of realism would be most effective in this specific context of sea level rise? But then also, could we extrapolate something bigger about maybe realism isn't most effective? Maybe people have reservations about it or resistance to it. And we actually saw that in a few of the participants, as they saw it as fear mongering. They didn't see it as educational or evocative at all. They actually resisted the attempt to try and visualize the realism of the situation, because they saw it as kind of as an attempt to elicit fear as opposed to understanding.
Fascinating.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Was it because it was too real, or because of the message?
Probably a bit of both, right? And like we did mental models research to make sure that the participants understood kind of the basic premise of climate change. So we were confident that the 19 people that we did focus groups with had a good understanding. So we did kind of a pre-test survey to kind of gauge their understanding.
Pre-screening, right?
Yeah, pre-screening to be okay. So they get climate change, they understand this from, it's related to carbon emissions, is related to glacial melt and kind of all these different things. So we kind of so we were confident that all our participants actually had a basic understanding of what climate change was and why it was happening. and
Right.
and its relationship to sea level rise.
Okay.
What was interesting is, it was an attempt for realism, but the images on NOAA's site were actually still pretty. They were still pretty pixelated, like they weren't exactly like Hollywood quality simulations, right? So they were kind of mid-range, and it was really clear because they took an image. So it was just really obvious. So because of, our demographics skewed younger because we were doing undergrads, I think they maybe because they're accustomed to a bit more refined visualizations or whatever it is, they saw it as kind of like almost cheesy and kind of like, so they talked a lot about the CGI-ness of it, the kind of
Yes.
highly pixelated nature of it, just this like water kind of like going up on this real image and is kind of not really clear. So it was interesting that we got feedback about the quality of the images, but then also the intent of showing the sea level rise they saw as trying to communicate a narrative that was based on fear to kind of say like, it's coming, this disaster's coming. So yeah, they were it was a mixed bag in terms of how they were actually responding to the quality themselves of the images. But for a lot of them, that was the hang up. It was an attempt to be real, it was an attempt to humanize, but they didn't do it well enough. So yeah, we thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. So if you're going to do realism, then if the realism were a higher quality, then they would have been more receptive to it.
For some, yeah, they would have. They would have been more receptive to it, or they at least would have been. They probably just wouldn't have had their initial resistance to kind of the critique of the actual visualizations themselves. But I'm not sure. I think regardless of how real the simulations were, I think there's always just going to be a segment of a group that's just going to be resistant to the message in general, based upon just the premise of it, about what it's trying to do, regardless of how nicely integrated the water is into these images. Or maybe the resistance was just because they had no idea what the landmarks were. There were a couple of people from the area who actually had no idea what some of the landmarks were. They had never seen the Great Bridge in Chesapeake. They'd never seen the Air and Space Museum in Hampton. They'd never seen the Virginia Beach Visitor Center. They'd never seen the unknown sailor statue in downtown Norfolk. So a lot of the landmarks that were chosen were kind of alienated or disconnected from the participants. So we were curious to see how realism would have worked if we chose their grandmother's house, or if we chose their favorite hangout in high school, or if we chose their elementary school or something like that, something that actually has emotional connection to, or their church where they want their kids to be raised in, right? Like something that's real and evocative for them. I think we would theorize that they would respond differently than to a visitor center.
So isn't realism unless it's real to me, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Those, like, you could show me those images and I'd probably have the same responses they would have, right? Because those aren't real to me, right?
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, it has to be real. So the real of the image, but also the real in terms of the actual emotional connection to it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how would you solve that, though? That's
what are you finding?
I'm currently taking suggestions, Janice. I have a comment box outside my office. I'm hoping people are just going to solve that problem for me any day now.
That's a huge problem. I know.
Yeah. So I'm trying to just break off a little bit and kind of just feel a sense of responsibility for my own community, and then kind of not get too cynical about the global stuff on climate, because I'm just trying to bite off what I could chew and just at least try to get our community to at least understand it and kind of participate in it. And it is a unique political, environment here with the Navy and stuff like that. And the Navy is actually taking charge on sea level rise as a national defense issue. So it's kind of crosses political lines in our region in ways that, you might not see kind of non-military cultures. So, I don't know. I think the solution is just a lot of labor, a lot of better understanding people, a lot of continuing to build case studies and models that show or that can empirically show that one specific strategy was proven to be more effective in this specific community, integrating that into the messaging of the municipal and county and state level agencies. So I think part of it is building a bridge between the academic research that's being done and then the messaging that's being done by the state and municipal employees. So building those bridges, I mean, obviously, as your audience would naturally nod along to that. Yes, absolutely. Yes to that. So bringing that research into there and then making sure that they're informing each other, but also that academics keep their work grounded enough to make sure it is useful to people, and not just theorize risk as a concept, which is still very useful, but can actually provide empirical studies towards better understanding of one specific thing. Because it's a small project within a small part of the country, within a small city, so it's like, it's really such a small part of it in terms of understanding about what these 19 focus group participants thought about this. But it was interesting to think about, just to kind of challenge that assumption a little bit, that realism isn't always the best, and that realism can actually have adverse effects if you have someone who's already kind of in a neutral or below position towards the topic. It can actually have the adverse effect. So if they think that realism is a strategy for engaging climate deniers, I think they should rethink that.
Yeah.
Or
Interesting.
be very careful if you're applying realism. You have to, adjust for all those factors.
Mhm.
And the fact that that the more local you can be, the better, right? Because that seems to be the overarching thing. It's like, it's great to have this information, but it really comes down filter to the really local area to communicate things. So understanding communication at a user level, so where the receiver is, right? And
Yeah.
translating all of those things into that receiving area.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of work that I know a lot of government employees who
Yeah.
are already worn out, and kind of, just, they, especially during COVID, they've done their best to communicate, and especially on the local level. We saw how COVID's working on the local level, because the policies and mandates have been changing. They change from region to region all the time, so you drive 5 miles this way and all of a sudden you don't have to do this thing or whatever. So it's they're doing a lot of work and they're overworked and overtired. So to even just kind of provide that partnership to government, business, academic partnership, I think is important. And then to kind of keep those studies going and keep validating them and building it up, and then sharing data, sharing research with other localities that are in similar part, not thinking that Virginia's unique in some ways, but it's also not unique in a lot of other ways. And it's just like any other coastal community. So there are generalities that you can start to do along the Atlantic coast, for example, that residents of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, down to Florida all care about. And there's similarities there, but we just kind of need to bring all that data together to see what those are.
In some ways, I feel like, you're like, oh, it's my research is just very local, but that's kind of what you're arguing about too.
Yeah.
It has to be local to be effective, right? So that getting actual results, that you're getting results is kind of the point.
Right.
As far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Your study is hyper local and
Yeah.
you're getting the results that you're getting.
Well,
Right.
and now the communication, if they weren't factoring in that local, hyper local community, then that's where things backfired. It would be better to not try to be, you can't fake being real. I think is
Right.
the message that I'm getting from you is you can't fake being real, because then you're going to have adverse effects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
And
a good way.
Better
But
for you not to try to fake being real. So if you're going to be, on a general basis, like for the entire, coastal region or the entire East Coast, then stay at that level. And then it needs to come down from there. Then people who are more local need to bring that message down to speak to more of a local community.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
But it is true. It is hard to filter all that information down. And then when things become politically charged, it gets even harder.
Right.
Because it gets,
Yeah.
more emotion involved in it and not logic.
Yeah. And then even once you get down to the city level or region level, the different demographic groups that are in different risk areas because of housing policies in the past, and just kind of the different, the relationship between redlining and, unfair housing practices and sea level rises, obviously those go, hand in glove for sure. So to even think about how you communicate risk, in kind of a more affluent, whiter community that's still kind of along the water, even that messaging is going to be a bit different because those people have the ability to move, right?
Mhm.
You big,
Yeah.
sell your house or pay 30 or 40 grand to raise your house 6 feet or whatever it is, or do these mitigation measures to put these things in your crawl space or whatever to lower your flood insurance or whatever it is. There's a variety of different other things that you can do.
Mhm.
So even once you get there, then you have racial dynamics, you have ethnic dynamics, you have age dynamics as well.
Mhm.
Obviously communicating like, hey, where your grandkid's going to live to a 19-year-old might not necessarily be where they're at.
They can't conceive their 30s, let alone.
Right. Hey, let me graduate undergrad first, and I'll get back to you. So
Right.
yeah, it's all those even kind of different social groups is another way to think through. And maybe there's more commonality between those social groups than between regionality, in attachment to place. So yeah, it interesting. There's a lot of good work that's being done on those topics, but I think we're just kind of, in the last maybe 10, 15 years, getting enough kind of case studies together to start to paint a broader picture.
Mhm.
And those were the light bulbs that were starting to form for me, right? I'm hearing sort of the same message from researchers doing vastly different things, or what they think are vastly different things, but that communication is local, right? That's audience, that's context, that's sense of place, that is far more dimensions than like, oh, well, this works for everybody, right? The one thing you said, like the one thing that stood out is like the effectiveness is correlated to how well you understand the community you're talking to.
Yeah.
Like that stands out for me in a way that connects a lot of different research pieces. This is really
From
fascinating.
a lot of different
Yeah.
angles. It's really, it's about the local. It's the smaller group, the community, and being able to bring it down to that, right? Which is a big challenge. And when you think in terms of like product companies that are making a product and they need to distribute it out places, and to be able to distribute it to remote places and speak to that local community.
You're thinking about Sweta and the water.
Well, no, I was thinking about Isidore and the voting machines too.
That too. Yeah. Yeah.
You have a variety of examples. Yeah.
Right. So see, we're talking, there's a
Yeah.
lot of
Like it just
people
keeps
that
coming, right?
yeah.
Yeah. And there are, it's not, so I'm doing kind of more qualitative, kind of smaller scale work, but we our ODU does the Life in Hampton Roads survey where they have the Social Science Research Center call thousands of residents, and it's kind of old school stuff, and faculty can request to have certain questions put on that survey to ask for the community. So sometimes we ask to put perceptions of sea level rise, perceptions of climate change, perceptions of whatever kind of risk there is, hurricane preparedness, something like that. So that's one way that we can get kind of, we can still get larger quantitative data sets to be able to understand, even just at a top view, even though we're not gathering the nuance about all the people and their different reactions and why. It's at least a good starting place to understand kind of, have a barometer of kind of where the public is at on a specific topic, and if it's kind of getting higher in terms of concern, lower in terms of concern, where kind of intervention starting there. So yeah, there is still lots of room for large scale quantitative data sets, and I still find that useful even on the national level.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Even in the article, I use Yale's research where they talk about the 6 Americas, and they kind of paint this picture almost, it's kind of persona based actually, in terms of kind of the 6 different types of people and their disposition towards climate change, and I use that as a starting point. So that's kind of national data set from the Yale Climate Change Communication Center, that was my starting point. So there is still room for quantitative, large scale understanding of kind of what is the framework here, and then we can kind of drill down in terms of developing localized strategies and stuff like that.
That's true. And I liked also what you were saying about getting the pulse on what the community at large is has an appetite for, right? It's kind of like, are they receptive? Because if they're not concerned about something, then they're not going to be receptive for information in that risk, right? If you're trying to risk communicate something that the general population really, they don't really think about or care about, it's not in their sphere of concern, then they're not, you can talk all you want. You can do all the realism you want. They're just not going to pay attention.
Yeah. So how do we elicit that care or concern?
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking, because, part of,
Yeah.
what, a lot of risk scholars say, like, you need that priming, that emotional priming. If you are concerned about something, you'll look out for information, and then all this stuff kind of kicks in and be like, okay, who's the most reputable organization? Okay, you have the science, you integrate it. But the passion is the foundation.
Yes.
And the passion doesn't come from data necessarily. It can come from a story, it can come from experience. A lot of the studies, these local case studies, relate how experiences change your perceptions. So you mentioned if I was in a plane crash, be like, if I was in a car accident too, that would get me on airplanes more. So like there are the experiential part. So the correlations between people who have had takeout flood insurance claims versus not, and their perception of risk is obviously heightened in those people who have had those experiences. So the plus side of those experiences, we can kind of leverage it and understand it. The downside is sometimes with some risks, it's kind of too late, because by the time they have the experience, it's, it's
already passed.
catastrophic.
Right.
So,
Right.
If you're talking about Sandy or Katrina or Harvey or something like that, then, that's the one-off experience that, might change moving forward when they're relocated, but ultimately it destroyed the community. So it's hard to say, but for the kind of mid-level flood things, they kind of get the scare. They see water go up to the porch. They think, oh, okay, next time it's going to do it. So let's take some mitigation measures. Let's get flood insurance. Let's put flood vents up. Let's do whatever. So yeah, I don't know. And then there's also that personal versus political thing too, right? So there are people who can be like, yeah, let me, put a natural shoreline in my beach backyard, or put flood vents up in my house, or build some barrier around it, or whatever it is, or raise it. But they still won't necessarily vote for a party who will stop it. So there's that kind of personal, kind of what you could do for your own personal property, protecting your own personal property,
Right.
versus
Versus
how
the
does that
collective greater, right?
act out politically. Yeah.
Yeah. That sense of community.
And that's part of that balancing of perceptions and risks and the things that it's all tied all into that psychology.
Mhm.
It is. And that, not to just, poke fun at that, but it's also, there's a lot of, tree loving liberals who make very poor decisions as well in terms of where they're living. So it's, so there's the disparity, the disconnect oftentimes between the politics and what we want in terms of global policy and energy policy and stuff like that doesn't always trickle down to our local decision making about where we live. And we always still want to live in that cool part of town where it's.
Yeah.
Oops. Oh, did he freeze?
I think he did. I'll cut some of this.
Yeah, we'll just wait for him to come.
There he is.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, it says my
That's
internet's
right.
unstable.
Internet is not a stable place.
So the decision making and people who want to live in the cool part of town, right? Versus the things that people are very complicated. We are very complicated. And it's just interesting. I don't think there's any easy answer to that. I mean, now your paper is out. It's just been published, right?
Yep.
Cool. So we'll provide a link for people. They can go find your article. But yeah, I think it's even harder when it comes to risk communication. Like there's even more complexities. There's no cut, like here's the easy answer. There's no easy answer, right? When it comes to communication, there's just an attempt to ever improve and ever improve.
Yeah.
And it takes work.
Big work. And sometimes experience. Yeah. So experience is the educator for this, but sometimes not. So
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. This was great.
Yeah,
this is great. Yeah.
Great.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for allowing me to talk about my research and providing a platform. It means a lot to me. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting research. So I highly recommend everybody read the article. So we'll include that link for everyone.
Great.
And again, thank you so much for spending time with us. I'm sorry we've gone a little over time, but it was interesting.
Absolutely.
Good. All right. Thanks, Janice. Thanks for